My name is Thomas Miller, and for the past 22 years, I have been teaching international relations theory at Dartmouth College with a particular emphasis on the works of John Mearsheimer, one of the most influential and controversial political scientists of our generation. I earned my doctorate in political science from the University of Chicago in 2003, where I studied under scholars who helped shape the realist tradition in American foreign policy thinking. And since then, I have dedicated my career to understanding how great powers compete, why they fight, and what their struggles reveal about the human condition in an anarchic international system. Today I want to share with you something that has been consuming my thoughts for the past several years, something that keeps me awake at night, not because it is sensational or dramatic, but because it is grounded in the cold logic of historical patterns and structural forces that have governed international politics for centuries. We are living through a transformation of the global order that will define the remainder of this century. A shift from American unipolarity to something more contested, more dangerous, and profoundly more uncertain. Before we proceed further into this analysis, I need to ask you to stay with me until the very end of this presentation because what I am about to explain cannot be grasped in fragments or sound bites, and the implications of what we are witnessing demand your full attention and your willingness to confront uncomfortable truths about America's position in the world. Please take a moment to comment below where you are watching from, your city and country, because I believe it matters profoundly where we stand geographically when we contemplate these global shifts, and I want to understand the perspective of those who are engaging with these ideas. Let me begin with a framework that John Mearsheimer developed in his seminal work, The Tragedy of Great Power Politics, published in 2001, which rests on 5 bedrock assumptions about how the international system functions. First, the international system is anarchic, meaning there is no higher authority above nation-states that can enforce rules or guarantee security. Second, all great powers possess offensive military capabilities that give them the capacity to hurt and potentially destroy one another. Third, states can never be certain about the intentions of other states, creating an environment of perpetual uncertainty and suspicion. Fourth, survival is the primary goal of every great power, trumping all other considerations including ideology, prosperity, or moral principle. Fifth, states are rational actors that think strategically about how to maximize their chances of survival in a hostile world. From these 5 assumptions, Mearsheimer derives a powerful and disturbing conclusion that states will constantly seek to accumulate power relative to their rivals, that cooperation between great powers is extraordinarily difficult to sustain, and that security-seeking nations will nonetheless be compelled to engage in competition and conflict with one another, even when none of them desires war. This is the tragedy he speaks of, the fact that rational actors pursuing rational strategies in an anarchic system will produce outcomes that nobody wants, but nobody can avoid. When I teach Mearsheimer to my students at Dartmouth, I often begin by asking them to consider a simple question that reveals the architecture of international politics more clearly than any abstract theory could. I ask them to imagine that they are the President of the United States and they receive credible intelligence that China is developing a revolutionary new weapon system that will give Beijing decisive military superiority over the United States and its allies within the next decade. What would they do? The overwhelming majority of students, regardless of their political beliefs or personal values, arrive at the same conclusion that they would take action to prevent China from achieving that superiority, either through diplomatic pressure, economic sanctions, covert operations, or in extreme cases, military strikes. This exercise demonstrates what Mearsheimer calls offensive realism, the idea that great powers are not content with the status quo when they have the opportunity to increase their relative power, and more importantly, that they will act to prevent potential rivals from gaining advantages that could threaten their survival. The students invariably recognize that in a world without a global government to protect them, they cannot afford to trust that China will use its newfound power benevolently, because the costs of being wrong are simply too catastrophic to accept. Now let us apply this framework to the concrete reality of our present moment, specifically to the rise of China as a peer competitor to the United States. In 1960, the United States accounted for approximately 40% of global gross domestic product, a staggering concentration of economic power that reflected the devastation of Europe and Asia following World War II and America's unmatched industrial capacity. By 1985, after a period of recovery in allied nations and the challenge posed by Japan's economic miracle, the American share of global GDP reached a local peak of about 34% during the Reagan era. But from that point forward, the trajectory has been unmistakably downward, falling to 30% by the year 2000, then to approximately 23% by 2010 during the financial crisis, and hovering around 24 to 26% in recent years according to various estimates. Meanwhile, China has experienced one of the most extraordinary economic transformations in human history, growing at an average annual rate of approximately 8.73% from 1989 through 2025, with the Chinese economy now valued at nearly $20 trillion and continuing to expand despite recent slowdowns to around 4.8% growth in the third quarter of 2025. These are not merely statistics in an economics textbook, they represent a fundamental redistribution of global power that carries profound strategic implications. In Mearsheimer's framework, regional hegemony is the ultimate goal of great powers because it provides maximum security in an anarchic world, and he argues persuasively that the United States achieved regional hegemony in the Western Hemisphere during the 19th and early 20th centuries by systematically eliminating European influence from the Americas and establishing itself as the uncontested dominant power. China, according to Mearsheimer's analysis, is pursuing the same objective in Asia that the United States pursued in its own neighborhood, seeking to become the regional hegemon by building economic interdependence with neighboring states, developing military capabilities that can deny American access to waters near China's coast, and gradually pushing the United States out of what Beijing considers its natural sphere of influence. This is not happening because Chinese leaders are inherently aggressive or because they harbor ideological hostility toward America, but because it is what great powers do when they have the capability to do so. The United States would behave exactly the same way if our positions were reversed, and indeed we did behave that way when we were a rising power challenging British dominance in our hemisphere. The clearest manifestation of China's drive toward regional hegemony is the Belt and Road Initiative launched by President Xi Jinping in 2013, which represents the most ambitious infrastructure and investment program in modern history. According to data compiled through the first half of 2025, cumulative Chinese engagement through the Belt and Road Initiative has reached $1.308 trillion since its inception, consisting of approximately $775 billion in construction contracts and $533 billion in non-financial investments across roughly 150 participating countries. To put this in perspective, that is more than the entire gross domestic product of most nations on Earth, deployed strategically to build ports, railways, highways, power plants, telecommunications networks, and digital infrastructure that will bind much of the developing world to Chinese supply chains, Chinese technology standards, and ultimately Chinese geopolitical interests. During just the first 6 months of 2025, China engaged in approximately $124 billion worth of Belt and Road activity through construction contracts and investments in about 176 deals, which is nearly double the level of engagement compared to previous years and demonstrates Beijing's determination to accelerate this strategy despite economic headwinds at home. When my colleagues in the economics department look at the Belt and Road Initiative, they see infrastructure development and trade facilitation, which are indeed important components of the program. But when I look at it through the lens of Mearsheimer's offensive realism, I see something far more consequential, which is the deliberate construction of a Sino-centric economic order that will give China leverage over nations that depend on Chinese investment, Chinese markets, Chinese technology, and Chinese financing. This is not charity or development assistance in the traditional Western sense. It is statecraft of the highest order, and it is achieving results that American policymakers are only beginning to comprehend. Countries that once looked automatically to Washington for leadership are now calculating their interests in a world where Beijing offers an alternative source of capital, an alternative development model, and an alternative vision of global governance that does not include lectures about democracy and human rights as preconditions for economic cooperation. Alongside this economic expansion, China has pursued a military modernization program that Mearsheimer predicted would be necessary if Beijing intended to challenge American dominance in the Western Pacific. The South China Sea has become the most visible theater of this military buildup, where China has transformed semi-submerged reefs and rocks into a network of militarized artificial islands equipped with runways, hangars, missile systems, radar installations, and naval facilities spanning approximately 3,200 hectares. Satellite imagery reveals that China now controls 20 outposts in the Paracel Islands and 7 in the Spratly Islands, with at least 4 of these transformed into fully operational naval and air bases capable of projecting power across one of the world's most strategically vital waterways. These installations include harbors, large runways, more than 72 fighter jet hangars across the three largest island bases, surface-to-air missile emplacements, anti-ship cruise missile systems, and extensive communications infrastructure that collectively represent what analysts have called the quickest example of mass dredging and landfill in human history. Beijing maintains that this military expansion is defensive in nature, designed to protect what China claims are its sovereign territorial rights in waters that have been contested by Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, and other Southeast Asian nations. But defensive and offensive capabilities are notoriously difficult to distinguish from one another, which is precisely one of Mearsheimer's key points about why uncertainty breeds competition in the international system. An airfield that China says is for defensive patrol missions looks exactly like an airfield that could be used to launch offensive strikes against American forces or allied nations in the event of a conflict. Surface-to-air missiles that Beijing claims are for protecting Chinese territory from attack are the same missiles that could be used to establish air superiority over contested waters and deny freedom of navigation to the United States Navy. The H-6 strategic bombers that China deployed to these island bases, some of which are nuclear capable, may be positioned there for deterrence purposes, but they also represent a potent offensive threat to American military installations throughout the Indo-Pacific region and potentially to the continental United States itself. What troubles me most as someone who has spent more than 2 decades studying great power competition is not that China is building military capabilities or expanding its economic influence, because these are entirely predictable behaviors for a rising power in an anarchic international system. What troubles me is that the United States appears to have been caught strategically unprepared for a competition that Mearsheimer warned about more than 20 years ago when he published The Tragedy of Great Power Politics. In that book, written when China's economy was a fraction of its current size and when American unipolarity seemed unassailable, Mearsheimer argued that if China continued its economic growth trajectory, it would inevitably seek to dominate Asia the way the United States dominates the Western Hemisphere, and that the United States would inevitably resist this challenge to its global primacy, creating the conditions for what he called an intense security competition with considerable potential for war. His prediction was not based on any particular animus toward China or any ideological preference for confrontation, but rather on his analysis of how great powers have always behaved throughout history when the distribution of power in the international system undergoes significant change. Yet despite this warning, the United States spent the first 2 decades of the 21st century focused primarily on counterterrorism operations in the greater Middle East, conflicts that consumed enormous blood and treasure while contributing relatively little to America's position vis-à-vis its only potential peer competitor. According to data from the United States Department of Defense, total military expenditure in Afghanistan from October 2001 through December 2020 reached $825 billion, with an additional $130 billion spent on reconstruction projects, bringing the total to approximately $955 billion for that conflict alone. The costs of the Iraq War were similarly staggering, and when combined with Afghanistan and related operations, estimates suggest that the United States government spent approximately $2.2 trillion in direct war costs, with total obligations including future veterans' care, interest on war borrowing, and other long-term commitments potentially reaching $6.5 trillion or more. To put this in perspective, $6.5 trillion represents roughly 10% of total American gross domestic product over that period, resources that might have been invested in infrastructure, education, research and development, or military capabilities specifically designed to counter a rising China, rather than insurgents in Kandahar or Fallujah. Mearsheimer's theory helps us understand why this 2-decade diversion proved so costly, not just in financial terms but in strategic opportunity cost. While the United States was bogged down in counterinsurgency campaigns that had no direct bearing on the balance of power in East Asia, China was methodically building the economic and military foundations for regional hegemony, investing hundreds of billions of dollars in infrastructure across Eurasia and Africa, modernizing its military forces with a specific focus on capabilities that could challenge American power projection in the Western Pacific, and cultivating diplomatic relationships with nations that had historically been firmly within the American sphere of influence. By the time American policymakers fully recognized the scale of the Chinese challenge, sometime around 2015 or 2016 when the Obama administration attempted to implement its Pivot to Asia strategy, Beijing had already achieved a position of strength that would be extraordinarily difficult to reverse without risking catastrophic conflict. The tragedy that Mearsheimer identifies is playing out before our eyes in real time, and it is a tragedy not because anyone intended it or because anyone is behaving irrationally, but because the structure of the international system makes it almost impossible for great powers to avoid competition, even when both sides would prefer to cooperate. China seeks security and prosperity for its people, which requires economic growth, which requires access to resources and markets, which requires influence over its strategic environment, which requires military capabilities to protect its interests, which inevitably threatens the security of neighboring states and the United States as the incumbent hegemon. The United States seeks to preserve its security and prosperity, which requires maintaining alliances and forward military presence in regions that matter to American interests, which requires preventing any single power from dominating Eurasia, which means resisting China's drive toward regional hegemony, which China perceives as an attempt to contain its rise and deny its people the security and prosperity they deserve. Both sides are acting rationally according to their own interests, both sides have legitimate security concerns, and yet the interaction of these rational strategies is producing an increasingly dangerous spiral of competition that neither side fully controls and that could easily escalate into catastrophic conflict through miscalculation or crisis. The question we must confront now is not whether this competition will continue, because Mearsheimer's framework makes clear that it will continue as long as both the United States and China remain great powers with conflicting interests in an anarchic international system, but rather how the rest of the world will respond to this fundamental reordering of global politics. What we are witnessing in real time is a phenomenon that historians will look back on as one of the defining transformations of the 21st century, which is the gradual but unmistakable erosion of the unipolar moment that America enjoyed after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the emergence of what scholars are calling a multipolar, or perhaps more accurately, a bipolar world order centered on Washington and Beijing as the two poles of power. The so-called unipolar moment, a term coined by conservative commentator Charles Krauthammer in 1990 to describe the period when the United States stood as the sole superpower without peer competitors or ideological challengers, lasted approximately 2 decades before the structural forces that Mearsheimer identified began to reassert themselves. During those 2 decades, American policymakers enjoyed unprecedented freedom of action, able to intervene militarily in the Balkans, the Middle East, and Central Asia without serious opposition from other great powers, able to expand NATO eastward toward Russia's borders without triggering a major war, able to promote democracy and human rights as universal values without facing powerful alternative models, and able to shape international institutions and norms largely according to American preferences and interests. But that unipolar moment is gone, a casualty not primarily of American mistakes or moral failures, although there were plenty of both, but rather of the inexorable logic of power balancing in an anarchic system. China's economic rise, which I discussed earlier in terms of gross domestic product and infrastructure investment, translated into military capabilities and diplomatic influence that have fundamentally altered the calculations of nations across the globe. The expansion of the BRICS organization represents perhaps the clearest institutional manifestation of this shift, transforming what began in 2009 as an informal grouping of Brazil, Russia, India, and China into a potential rival to Western-dominated institutions like the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and even the United Nations Security Council itself. At the 2023 summit in Johannesburg, South Africa, BRICS formally invited 6 additional members including Argentina, Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates, although Argentina ultimately declined to join after the election of far-right President Javier Milei in December 2023, while Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, and the UAE officially became members in January 2024, expanding the bloc to 9 full members. The combined economic weight of this expanded BRICS grouping is staggering, representing approximately 39% of global gross domestic product measured in purchasing power parity terms and 46% of the world's population, according to data compiled through 2023 and early 2024. The significance of BRICS expansion extends far beyond economic statistics, however, because it represents a fundamental challenge to the institutional architecture that the United States and its European allies constructed after World War II. When nations like Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, longtime security partners of the United States with military relationships stretching back decades, choose to align themselves with an organization that explicitly positions itself as an alternative to Western-dominated multilateral institutions, they are signaling their calculation that the future distribution of global power will be more balanced than the past, and that hedging their bets by maintaining relationships with both Washington and Beijing makes more strategic sense than placing all their eggs in the American basket. Iran's membership in BRICS is particularly significant because it demonstrates that even nations under severe American economic sanctions can find alternative pathways to international commerce and diplomatic recognition through institutions that operate outside the dollar-denominated financial system. The fact that BRICS collectively controls approximately 42% of global central bank foreign exchange reserves and has been actively pursuing de-dollarization initiatives through increased use of national currencies in bilateral trade, expanded cross-border payment systems like China's CRIS, alternative to SWIFT, and even discussions about creating a common BRICS currency, suggests that the financial foundations of American hegemony are being challenged in ways that would have been unthinkable during the unipolar moment. If you are finding value in this analysis and want to support this work, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and activate the notification bell so you will be alerted when I release future content examining these critical issues that will shape all of our futures. I would also love to hear from you in the comments about where you are watching from, your city and country, because understanding the geographic distribution of this audience helps me appreciate the global nature of the conversation we are having about these transformations. The de-dollarization trend that BRICS represents deserves particular attention because the role of the United States dollar as the world's reserve currency has been one of the most important sources of American power since the Bretton Woods Agreement established the dollar's centrality to international finance in 1944. The exorbitant privilege that comes with issuing the global reserve currency allows the United States to borrow at lower interest rates than would otherwise be possible to run persistent trade deficits without facing the kind of currency crises that afflict other nations, and to impose economic sanctions that can effectively cut targeted nations off from the international financial system. But this privilege depends on the willingness of other nations to hold dollars and conduct international transactions in dollars. And there is growing evidence that this willingness is eroding as nations seek to reduce their vulnerability to American financial pressure. Data from the Bank for International Settlements shows that the share of United States dollars in cross-border lending by core BRICS countries declined from 67% in 2016 to 55% by early 2024, with the most significant decline occurring in the past 4 years, while the share of BRICS currencies in their own cross-border banking claims increased by 6 percentage points to 15%, and the share of other emerging market currencies increased by 4 percentage points to 19% during the same period. In international payments processed through the SWIFT system, core BRICS currencies have reached a 6.4% share as of 2024, while in over-the-counter foreign exchange derivatives they account for 6.8% as of 2022, both representing significant increases from just 4 to 8 years earlier. These percentages may seem small in absolute terms, but they represent a clear directional trend away from dollar dominance and toward a more multipolar currency system. And more importantly, they demonstrate that viable alternatives to the dollar-based system are emerging and gaining traction. The most dramatic progress in de-dollarization has occurred in emerging market fuel trade, where the BRICS share nearly doubled from 20% to 37% of total turnover in 2023, reflecting the fact that major oil producers like Russia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE are increasingly willing to accept payment in currencies other than dollars, particularly Chinese yuan, for their energy exports. This development strikes at the heart of the petrodollar system that has been a cornerstone of American financial hegemony since the 1970s, when the United States reached an agreement with Saudi Arabia that oil would be priced and traded in dollars in exchange for American security guarantees, effectively creating guaranteed global demand for United States currency. If that system continues to erode, and the trajectory suggests it will, then America will face significantly higher borrowing costs, reduced ability to finance government deficits through foreign purchases of Treasury securities, and diminished capacity to use financial sanctions as a foreign policy tool, all of which will constrain American power in ways that most citizens and even most policymakers do not yet fully appreciate. Now, I need to address an aspect of this transformation that Mearsheimer himself has been particularly vocal about, which is the role that American foreign policy choices have played in accelerating the very outcomes that Washington ostensibly sought to prevent. In 2014, when Russia annexed Crimea and began supporting separatists in eastern Ukraine, Mearsheimer published a controversial article in Foreign Affairs titled "Why the Ukraine Crisis is the West's Fault," in which he argued that NATO's eastward expansion toward Russia's borders, combined with Western efforts to pull Ukraine into the European Union's orbit, represented a threat to core Russian security interests that Moscow was certain to resist through force if necessary. His analysis, rooted in offensive realism, suggested that Russia's actions were not primarily driven by Vladimir Putin's alleged authoritarianism or imperial nostalgia, but rather by the structural imperative that great powers face to control their near abroad and prevent potentially hostile alliances from establishing themselves along their borders. This argument was intensely unpopular in Washington and European capitals, where the prevailing narrative held that NATO expansion was purely defensive in nature and that democratic nations had every right to join whatever alliances they chose without interference from autocratic neighbors. But Mearsheimer's point was not about rights or legitimacy in some abstract moral sense. It was about the predictable behavior of great powers in an anarchic system, where survival is the primary goal and where uncertainty about the intentions of other states creates powerful incentives to maximize relative power and strategic depth. The subsequent Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, an escalation of the conflict that had been simmering since 2014, seemed to many observers to vindicate Mearsheimer's analysis, demonstrating that Moscow was indeed willing to pay enormous costs in blood, treasure, and international condemnation to prevent Ukraine from becoming a member of NATO and a forward operating base for Western military power along Russia's southwestern border. Now, I want to be absolutely clear that recognizing the strategic logic behind Russia's actions is not the same as justifying them morally or legally, and I believe that Putin's decision to launch a full-scale invasion was a catastrophic error that has caused immense suffering and violated fundamental principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity that are essential to any stable international order. But as a scholar who studies great power politics through the lens of Mearsheimer's offensive realism, I also have to acknowledge that his theory predicted this outcome with uncomfortable accuracy more than 8 years before it occurred, and that American and European policymakers ignored his warnings at tremendous cost, not only to Ukraine, which has been devastated by the war, but also to the broader project of maintaining a rules-based international order that depends on great powers showing at least some restraint in their competition with one another. The Ukraine crisis illustrates a broader pattern that has characterized American foreign policy in the post-Cold War era, which is a tendency to assume that the spread of liberal democracy and Western institutions represents the natural endpoint of political development, and that resistance to this process stems from the personal pathologies of individual leaders like Putin or Xi Jinping, rather than from structural features of the international system. This assumption, which political scientist Francis Fukuyama famously articulated as the end of history in 1989, led American policymakers to pursue policies of NATO expansion, democracy promotion, and regime change that Mearsheimer's offensive realism would predict are likely to provoke balancing behavior from other great powers who perceive these initiatives as threats to their security. The Trump administration represented a partial break from this pattern, with President Donald Trump repeatedly questioning the value of NATO, demanding that European allies increase their defense spending to at least 2% and eventually 4% of gross domestic product, and adopting an America First foreign policy that prioritized burden sharing with allies and skepticism toward multilateral institutions that constrained American freedom of action. Trump's critique of NATO burden sharing, whatever one thinks of his diplomatic style or broader agenda, contained an element of truth that has been acknowledged even by analysts who oppose his policies. As of January 2017, when Trump took office, only 5 of NATO's nearly 30 member states were meeting their commitment to spend 2% of GDP on defense, meaning that the United States was shouldering a disproportionate share of the alliance's military costs, while European nations enjoyed the security benefits of American protection without making commensurate investments in their own defense capabilities. By 2024, this situation had improved somewhat due to pressure from both the Trump and Biden administrations, but the fundamental issue remains that the United States spends approximately 3.4% of its GDP on defense, while most European NATO members spend significantly less, creating what economists call a free rider problem where allies consume a public good, in this case security, without paying their fair share of the costs. The total United States defense budget in fiscal year 2024 exceeded $800 billion, dwarfing the combined military spending of all European NATO members and raising legitimate questions about whether this level of spending serves American interests or whether it allows European nations to invest more heavily in social programs and infrastructure while outsourcing their security to Washington. But the deeper issue that Mearsheimer would point us toward is not about burden sharing in NATO or even about Trump's particular approach to alliances. It is about whether the United States has the capability and the will to maintain its position as the guarantor of global security in an era when its relative power is declining and when the costs of that role are becoming increasingly burdensome to the American people. The erosion of the unipolar moment that I described earlier means that the United States faces more capable competitors, more complex security challenges, and more constrained resources than at any time since the end of the Cold War. And this new reality requires a fundamental reassessment of American grand strategy rather than simply trying to recreate the conditions of 1995 or 2005 when American dominance seemed assured. Internal political polarization in the United States, combined with growing popular frustration over decades of military interventions that failed to achieve their stated objectives and consumed trillions of dollars that might have been invested domestically, suggests that there may be declining political support for the kind of forward-deployed, globally engaged posture that has characterized American foreign policy since 1945. This brings me to what I consider the most profound question raised by the shift from unipolarity to multipolarity, which is not primarily a question about military capabilities or economic statistics, but rather a question about American identity and purpose. For more than 75 years, the United States has defined itself as the leader of the free world, the indispensable nation whose values and institutions represented the ultimate direction of human political development, and whose security guarantees and economic power created the conditions for unprecedented peace and prosperity among the community of democratic nations. This self-conception is deeply embedded in American political culture, taught in our schools, celebrated in our popular culture, and invoked by politicians of both parties as a source of national pride and global purpose. But what happens to this identity when the United States is no longer the uncontested hegemon, when other nations have viable alternatives to American leadership, when the rules-based international order that Washington claims to uphold is perceived by much of the world as a set of rules that America enforces selectively against its adversaries while exempting itself and its allies? Mearsheimer's offensive realism offers no easy answers to these existential questions because his theory is fundamentally immoral, concerned with how states behave rather than how they should behave, focused on the distribution of power rather than the content of values or the legitimacy of norms. But I believe his framework can help us think more clearly about the choices America faces in this new era by stripping away illusions and forcing us to confront hard realities about power, competition, and survival in an anarchic world. The first reality is that China's rise cannot be reversed through wishful thinking or moral condemnation, and that barring some internal collapse of the Chinese Communist Party or catastrophic policy errors by Beijing's leadership, China will remain a peer competitor to the United States for the foreseeable future. The second reality is that most of the world's nations will not choose sides definitively between Washington and Beijing, but will instead pursue hedging strategies that preserve their autonomy and maximize their options, which means that the Cold War model of rigid bloc competition is unlikely to be replicated. The third reality is that American power, while still formidable in absolute terms, is declining relative to the power of other states, and this relative decline will require painful adjustments in American strategy, force posture, and perhaps most importantly in American expectations about what role we can and should play in global affairs. The paths forward are not pleasant to contemplate. One option is confrontation. A new Cold War with China that involves military buildups, rival alliance systems, competing spheres of influence, and potentially catastrophic conflicts over flashpoints like Taiwan or the South China Sea. This path has the advantage of clarity and the appeal to those who believe that American values must be defended at any cost, but it also carries extraordinary risks, including the possibility of nuclear war between two heavily armed great powers, and it ignores Mearsheimer's insight that security competition between great powers is tragic precisely because it produces outcomes that neither side desires. A second option is cooperation, which would involve accepting China as a peer competitor with legitimate interests in its own region, negotiating spheres of influence that both sides can live with, and managing the competition through diplomatic engagement rather than military encirclement. This path has the advantage of reducing the risk of catastrophic war and potentially allowing both nations to focus resources on internal development rather than arms races, but it requires a degree of restraint and strategic humility that has been in short supply in Washington, and it would almost certainly be attacked as appeasement by domestic political opponents. The third option, which I believe is both the most difficult and the most necessary, is what I would call reinvention, a fundamental rethinking of American strategy that begins not with external threats, but with internal renewal. If the source of American power has always been our dynamic economy, our capacity for innovation, our ability to attract talented immigrants, our stable democratic institutions, and our founding commitment to liberty and self-government, then the greatest threat to American security is not China's Belt and Road Initiative or Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but rather the erosion of these internal sources of strength through partisan dysfunction, crumbling infrastructure, educational underperformance, economic inequality, and social fragmentation. Mearsheimer's theory tells us that power is the currency of international politics, but power in the 21st century depends not only on military force, but on technological innovation, economic productivity, social cohesion, and institutional legitimacy. A nation that cannot build high-speed rail, cannot provide affordable health care to its citizens, cannot agree on basic facts about elections or public health, and cannot renovate airports and bridges that are literally falling apart, is not a nation that will successfully compete with a China that, whatever its flaws and internal contradictions, has demonstrated remarkable capacity for long-term planning and infrastructure development. This is ultimately what I try to convey to my students at Dartmouth when we study Mearsheimer's work and its application to contemporary international politics. Understanding offensive realism is not about accepting defeat or abandoning American values. It is about seeing the world clearly without the distortions of ideology or wishful thinking, and then using that clear vision to make better choices about how to preserve what matters most. The tragedy of great power politics, as Mearsheimer titled his most important book, is that states pursuing security can create insecurity, that nations seeking peace can stumble into war, and that rational actors following rational strategies can produce irrational outcomes. But tragedy is not the same as inevitability, and recognizing the structural forces that shape international politics is the first step toward navigating those forces more skillfully. The contest between the United States and China will define this century, and how America responds to that contest with wisdom or with rigidity, with strategic clarity or with nostalgic longing for a unipolar moment that cannot be recovered will determine not only our own future, but the future of the international system that has kept great power war at bay for nearly 8 decades since 1945. That is the challenge before us, and meeting it will require the best of American ingenuity, resilience, and yes, the capacity for reinvention that has always been our greatest strength.